In the winter of 1945, entire villages vanished beneath the snow, not from bombs, but from fear. As the Soviet Red Army thundered into Eastern Europe, millions of German civilians began a desperate flight westward, haunted by stories of vengeance, violence, and the collapse of everything they knew. This is the forgotten war behind the war, not fought with tanks, but endured by families, elders, and children caught in the wake of Nazi defeat. When the Eastern Front collapsed, the civilian world that Germany had built across Eastern Europe was torn apart with terrifying speed. What happened to those German civilians in Soviet territory after World War II? Forced marches, mass deportations, and brutal occupations rewrote their lives. This video uncovers their fate, a story of survival, suffering, and silence, and asks why their experience still shapes the shadows of history today. The Eastern Front was the deadliest theater of World War II, a vast, brutal expanse stretching from Berlin to the Volga. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, it pushed deep into Soviet territory, occupying vast regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. But by 1943, the tide had turned. The Red Army began its relentless westward advance, reclaiming territory and pursuing the German war machine into its own heartland. By then, millions of ethnic Germans, some settlers, others long-established communities, lived in Eastern Europe. From East Prussia to Silesia, the Sudetenland, to parts of the Baltics and Volga region, German civilians formed a widespread presence. Many had lived in these lands for generations. Others were resettled there during Nazi conquests under the Heim ins Reich program. Their world was intertwined with Hitler's imperial ambitions. But when the Wehrmacht began to crumble, these same civilians were no longer settlers. They were stranded targets. As Soviet forces advanced, they brought with them not just liberation, but also retribution for the atrocities committed by the Nazis on Soviet soil. The final year of World War II brought an apocalypse to the Eastern Front. By mid-1944, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration, a devastating offensive that shattered the German Army Group Center and pushed the front lines hundreds of miles west in mere weeks. German-held cities and villages, once thought safe, were suddenly on the front lines of a fast-moving and vengeful Red Army. German civilians, who had been encouraged to settle in Eastern Europe under Nazi policies, were now caught in a whirlwind. Hitler's regime hesitated to evacuate the civilian population, fearing it would signal weakness. But when Soviet troops approached, panic spread. Families fled in winter, with few supplies and less protection, under skies darkened by Soviet aircraft. The roads were choked with carts, horses, and endless columns of refugees, elderly, children, the wounded, all fleeing westward into a frozen unknown. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania saw some of the most desperate evacuations. The crossing of the Vistula Lagoon turned into a frozen death trap. Civilians died from exposure, artillery fire, or drowned when ice cracked beneath the weight of wagons. Meanwhile, Operation Hannibal, the largest seaborne evacuation in history, transported hundreds of thousands across the Baltic Sea. But not all made it. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff by a Soviet submarine claimed over 9,000 lives, most of them civilians and children. For those left behind, Soviet occupation brought terror. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal warfare and the horrors inflicted by the Nazis, often took brutal revenge. Rape was widespread. Looting and executions were common. Entire communities were erased in days. The collapse of the Eastern Front wasn't just a military defeat. It was the violent unmaking of a German civilian world built during the war. That collapse shattered families, erased towns, and left scars that would linger for generations. When the Red Army took control of former German-occupied territories, life for the civilians left behind descended into a grim and uncertain new reality. These were not standard occupations. They were marked by deep-seated vengeance, chaotic governance, and a desire to erase all traces of German control. Soviet troops often acted without restraint. In many areas, mass rapes were carried out with shocking frequency and brutality. Women of all ages were targeted, some repeatedly, leading to a wave of suicides and long-term trauma that survivors carried for life. Soviet authorities were aware, but often turned a blind eye in the immediate post-liberation chaos. Looting became a daily threat. Soviet soldiers stripped homes of anything valuable, from furniture to livestock and even clothing. Entire villages were depopulated as civilians were rounded up and sent to labor camps in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and beyond. Many would never return. Those considered useful were often forced into agricultural or industrial labor to help rebuild the devastated Soviet Union. For those who remained in place, survival meant submission. German language schools were closed, churches shuttered, and German cultural life wiped out. Many civilians were forbidden from speaking their language or practicing their traditions. Even young children were marked by their identity, often facing punishment or exile simply for being German. Meanwhile, Soviet-backed Polish, Czech, and other Eastern European governments began the process of de-Germanization. German civilians were stripped of property, denied legal status, and forced to wear identification tags. Entire communities were expelled in waves, sometimes violently, as post-war borders shifted west. This wasn't merely occupation, it was erasure. For the German civilians in these lands, the war didn't end in 1945. It morphed into a grim struggle for identity, safety, and basic humanity under the weight of collective punishment. The collapse of the Eastern Front and the Soviet occupation that followed unleashed one of the greatest civilian catastrophes of the 20th century. Though exact numbers remain debated, historians estimate that between 500,000 to 2 million German civilians died during the final months of the war and its chaotic aftermath. These deaths came from a cruel mix of exposure, starvation, disease, executions, and atrocities during the mass flight and expulsions. Tens of thousands disappeared into the Soviet labor system, the Gulag. Civilians, including women and teenagers, were deported in boxcars to forced labor camps. Some were taken for years, others never returned. The trauma of vanishing family members without records, graves, or closure left holes in countless lives. The scale of displacement was staggering. Over 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled or fled from Central and Eastern Europe between 1944 and 1950. The sheer speed and brutality of this forced migration meant that most left everything behind: homes, farms, heirlooms, even their dead in cemeteries. They arrived in a shattered Germany that barely recognized them, where hunger, discrimination, and homelessness awaited. Many survivors lived with lifelong trauma, their stories silenced during the Cold War for political reasons. In East Germany, such suffering was downplayed to preserve Soviet alliances. In the West, discussions were muted, overshadowed by Nazi guilt. Yet behind the statistics are personal tragedies, generations uprooted, families destroyed, and entire cultures erased. The civilian cost of the Eastern Front's collapse remains one of history's most haunting footnotes. The suffering of German civilians in Soviet-occupied territories after World War II remains one of the most politically charged and emotionally complex chapters in European history. For decades, these events were buried beneath broader narratives of Nazi guilt, Soviet victory, and Cold War ideology. Only in recent years has there been more open discussion of the trauma endured by ordinary Germans, particularly those with no direct role in the Nazi regime. The legacy of this suffering has shaped memory across generations. In Germany, particularly in the West, the topic of expulsions and civilian losses was long a quiet wound. The federal government only officially acknowledged the full scale of these tragedies decades later. In the East, where the Soviet narrative dominated, these stories were often outright suppressed. Complicating the memory is the role of Nazi propaganda. Events like the Nemmersdorf massacre, where Soviet troops killed dozens of German civilians, were used by Goebbels to instill fear and harden German resistance. After the war, this propaganda legacy made it difficult to separate truth from exaggeration and honest accounts from myth-making. Today, historians seek a balanced view, acknowledging the horrors German civilians experienced without erasing the broader context of Nazi aggression and genocide. The challenge lies in remembering suffering without weaponizing it, in confronting trauma without justifying prior crimes. Ultimately, this legacy asks a difficult but essential question. How do we remember victims who were also part of a nation responsible for so much pain? The collapse of the Eastern Front in 1944-45 was not only a military defeat, it was a human disaster of enormous proportions. For German civilians living in territories overtaken by the Soviet Union, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new ordeal. Violence, displacement, exile, and erasure. Millions fled, millions more were expelled or perished, and entire communities that had existed for generations vanished almost overnight. Their suffering, long overshadowed by the crimes of the Nazi regime, now stands as a sobering reminder that war's devastation extends far beyond the battlefield. It reaches deep into the lives of the powerless, those caught between empires, ideologies, and revenge. In remembering these stories, we are not asked to absolve or forget the past, but to face its full complexity. Can a society truly heal if it only remembers the victims it chooses to see?